The quiet panic. You know that feeling when you're driving late at night and you take a wrong turn and suddenly everything around you just feels off? The streetlights seem dimmer, the houses look abandoned, and there's this eerie silence that makes your skin crawl. Well, what I'm about to tell you makes that feeling look like a walk in the park. Last month, I was driving through rural Montana, heading back from a camping trip with my buddy Marcus. We'd been on the road for about 6 hours, and it was getting dark fast. The GPS on my phone kept losing signal, which wasn't unusual for that area, but what happened next was something I'm still trying to wrap my head around. We missed our exit and ended up on this unmarked dirt road that seemed to stretch on forever. Marcus was asleep in the passenger seat, so I figured I'd just follow the road until it connected back to the highway. That's when I saw the sign, weathered, barely readable, but it said Millbrook, population 847. I'd never heard of Millbrook before, but I thought maybe we could stop there, get directions, maybe grab some gas. The thing is, when we finally reached what should have been the town center, there was nothing there. I'm not talking about a small town or a dying town. I'm talking about absolutely nothing. No buildings, no foundations, no streets. Just empty grassland stretching out in every direction under the moonlight. But here's where it gets really weird. My car's odometer showed we'd driven exactly 12 miles from that sign to reach this empty field. Marcus woke up when I stopped the car, and when I told him what happened, he just stared at me like I'd lost my mind. He insisted we must have taken another turn somewhere, that I was just confused in the dark. So we turned around and drove back the same way we came. 12 miles later, we reached that same weathered sign again. Millbrook, population 847. Now I know what you're thinking. Maybe the town was abandoned. Maybe the buildings were torn down. Maybe there's a perfectly logical explanation for all of this. Trust me, I thought the same thing. But when we got home the next day, I started doing some research. And that's when things got really disturbing. According to every map I could find online, there is no town called Millbrook in that area of Montana. There never was. I checked historical records, census data, old newspapers, everything. The closest thing I could find was a mining settlement called Mill Creek that existed in the 1890s, but that was over 200 miles away from where we were driving. But then I found something that made my blood run cold. On an obscure genealogy website, buried deep in a forum discussion about ghost towns, someone had posted a black and white photograph from 1952. The caption read, "Main Street, Millbrook, Montana," taken just before the evacuation. The photo showed a typical small American town, a post office, a general store, a church with a tall steeple. Houses lined up along tree-covered streets. It looked exactly like what you'd expect a town of 847 people to look like. The person who posted the photo claimed their grandfather had lived there as a child. According to their story, everyone in Millbrook was forced to leave in the summer of 1952 due to what the government called geological instability. The entire town was supposedly demolished and the land was sealed off. But here's the thing that really got to me. In the comments below that photo, there were dozens of other people sharing similar stories about their relatives who had lived in Millbrook. All of them said the same thing. Their families never talked about what really happened there, and any official records of the town seemed to have disappeared. I became obsessed with finding out more. I spent hours every night searching through archives, calling local historical societies, even reaching out to elderly residents in nearby towns. Most people had never heard of Millbrook, but a few of the older folks would get this strange look in their eyes when I mentioned the name. They'd change the subject or suddenly remember they had somewhere else to be. Then I found Harold. Harold Jennings was 87 years old and living in a nursing home about 50 miles from where Marcus and I had our experience. When I called and mentioned Millbrook, there was this long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, he said, "You shouldn't be asking about that place, son. Some things are better left buried," but I convinced him to meet with me. And what he told me during that visit changed everything. Harold had been 19 years old in 1952, working as a mail carrier for the Postal Service. His route included Millbrook, and he remembered that final summer very clearly. According to Harold, strange things had been happening in Millbrook for months before the evacuation. People were reporting bizarre incidents, clocks running backwards, radios picking up broadcasts from decades in the past, children claiming they could see people who weren't there. The local doctor documented dozens of cases of what he called temporal displacement syndrome. Residents would lose hours or even days without any memory of where they'd been. Harold told me that on his last mail delivery to Millbrook, the town felt different. The streets were empty, but not in a normal way. He said it felt like the emptiness had weight to it, like the absence of people was somehow heavier than their presence should have been. When he knocked on doors to deliver letters, nobody answered, but he could hear voices inside the houses. Conversations, laughter, children playing. But when he looked through the windows, the rooms were completely empty. The government trucks arrived the next week. Military personnel in unmarked vehicles went door to door, giving residents 24 hours to pack their essential belongings and leave. Harold never saw any of the Millbrook residents again after that day. The official story was geological instability, but Harold said the real reason was classified at a level far above his clearance. What Harold told me next made me realize that Marcus and I might have stumbled into something much bigger than just a case of mistaken directions. He said that over the years he'd heard rumors from other postal workers, truck drivers, and travelers about people who claimed to have driven through Millbrook long after it was supposed to have been demolished. Always at night, always by accident, and always with the same result. They'd see the sign, drive 12 miles through what appeared to be a thriving small town, and then find themselves in an empty field with no explanation for what they'd experienced. Harold leaned forward in his chair and looked me directly in the eyes. "Son," he said, "there are places in this world where time doesn't work the way it's supposed to. Millbrook is one of those places. Whatever happened there in 1952, it left something behind. Something that doesn't understand it's supposed to be gone. I left that nursing home with more questions than answers, but I knew I had to go back. I had to return to that stretch of road and find out what Marcus and I had really experienced that night. What I discovered on my second trip to Millbrook would change everything I thought I knew about the nature of reality itself. But before I tell you about that return journey, there's something else you need to understand about the history of this place. Something that Harold didn't tell me during our first meeting. Something that would explain why the government was so desperate to erase Millbrook from existence, and why some secrets are too dangerous to stay buried. 3 weeks later, I made the drive back to Montana, this time alone. Marcus thought I was losing my mind, and honestly, maybe I was. But I had to know the truth about what we'd encountered that night. I brought camping gear, multiple cameras, and enough supplies to stay in the area for several days if necessary. I reached the unmarked dirt road just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in deep purples and oranges. My hands were shaking as I turned onto that familiar path. The same path that had led Marcus and me into something that shouldn't exist. The odometer read 0 as I reset it, wanting to track every mile of this journey. At exactly 12 miles, I saw it again. That weathered sign emerging from the growing darkness. Millbrook, population 847. But this time, something was different. This time, I didn't drive past it into an empty field. This time, I saw the town. It was exactly like the photograph I'd found online. Main Street stretched out before me, lined with perfectly preserved buildings from the 1950s. Warm yellow light glowed from windows, and I could see the silhouettes of people moving around inside their homes. The church steeple rose against the starlit sky, and I could even hear the faint sound of music drifting from what looked like a local diner. I parked my car on Main Street and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The air smelled like coal smoke and fresh bread, and somewhere in the distance I could hear children laughing and playing. Everything felt incredibly real. Incredibly normal. If I hadn't known better, I would have thought I'd stumbled upon some perfectly preserved piece of 1950s America. But as I walked down the street, I started noticing things that made my skin crawl. The people I glimpsed through windows never seemed to notice me, even when I waved or knocked on glass. Their movements were repetitive, almost mechanical, like they were stuck in some kind of loop. A woman in a kitchen window kept washing the same plate over and over again. A man reading a newspaper in his living room would finish the page, turn to the next one, then immediately flip back and start reading the same page again. The music from the diner never changed either. It was the same song playing on repeat, some cheerful tune from the early 50s that grew more and more unsettling the longer I listened to it. When I pushed open the diner door, the bell above it rang, but everyone inside continued their conversations as if I wasn't there. A waitress walked right through me as if I was made of air. That's when I realized the horrible truth about Millbrook. The town wasn't gone. The people weren't gone. They were trapped, caught in some kind of temporal loop that kept them reliving the same moments over and over again for the past 70 years. Whatever the government had done here in 1952, whatever experiment or incident they were trying to cover up, it had created this pocket of frozen time where the residents of Millbrook were condemned to repeat their final days forever. I tried to interact with them, tried to break through whatever barrier separated us, but it was useless. They couldn't see me, couldn't hear me, couldn't acknowledge my presence in any way. I was a ghost in their world, or maybe they were ghosts in mine. I spent hours walking through their streets, documenting everything with my camera, but when I reviewed the footage later, all I had were empty buildings and vacant lots. As dawn approached, I felt the town beginning to fade around me. The buildings became translucent, the sounds grew distant, and the warm lights in the windows started to dim. By the time the sun fully rose, I was standing alone in that empty field again, surrounded by nothing but grassland and silence. But I wasn't alone. Harold was there, sitting on the tailgate of an old pickup truck that I swear hadn't been there moments before. He looked at me with sad, knowing eyes and said, "You saw them, didn't you? You saw what's left of Millbrook." He explained that he'd been coming back to this spot for decades, watching over the town that existed between sunset and sunrise. He told me about the government experiment, how they'd been testing something called temporal displacement technology using Millbrook as a testing ground. The residents had been unwilling subjects in an attempt to create pockets of controlled time, but something had gone catastrophically wrong. The entire town had become unstuck from normal time, trapped in a loop that could only be accessed during certain conditions. Harold said that people like Marcus and me, people who stumbled upon Millbrook by accident, were witnesses to something the government had spent 70 years trying to erase from history. As we stood there in the morning light, Harold handed me a manila envelope filled with documents he'd been collecting for decades. Classified reports, witness testimonies, and photographs that proved everything I'd experienced was real. He told me that he was getting old, and he needed someone younger to continue watching over Millbrook to make sure the truth didn't die with him. I drove home that day with more questions than answers, but also with a responsibility I never asked for. The residents of Millbrook are still out there, trapped in their endless loop, and someone needs to remember them. Someone needs to make sure their story doesn't disappear completely. So now you know the truth about the town that vanished. Millbrook exists, but only for those who are meant to find it. And somewhere out there on unmarked dirt roads in rural Montana, other travelers are taking wrong turns that lead them into places that shouldn't exist, witnessing echoes of tragedies that were supposed to stay buried forever. If you ever find yourself driving late at night and you see a weathered sign for a town you've never heard of, maybe it's better to keep driving. Some mysteries are meant to stay unsolved, and some doors are better left unopened. But if you do decide to investigate, just remember that once you've seen what lies beyond the veil of our normal reality, you can never unsee it. The quiet panic I felt that first night in Millbrook never really goes away. It just becomes part of you. A constant reminder that the world is far stranger and more dangerous than we ever imagined.